Welcome everyone. So today I want to give a presentation on strength and conditioning for full contact karate. So essentially today's presentation will be all about the basics of strength and conditioning. It's not going to be too in depth, but I want to provide you with a nice place to start and just a bit of information around how do we do it. So some initial considerations to think of. The 1 to 3% rule essentially states that when you get into the gym or you get into your training session, you should be able to improve on your performance, your last performance by 1 to 3%. And this has got a bit to do with your health status and how well recovered you are. So essentially, if you're under recovered, then you're not going to be able to do a better performance than last time. So we want to think of that each time we approach our training. Do you have any current or old injuries? So this is something that's going to make a huge impact on your overall movement capacity, movement function. So if you've got any current or old injuries, making sure you're working with a quality professional, someone that can help you rehab these things and not just rehab them to get a little bit better, just to make sure that you're getting back to full function and potentially even stronger. Some other considerations we want to talk about are posture. So if you do have excessively bad posture, you want to try and work on these things because it will have some kind of effect on your overall movement capacity. The next point I wanted to talk about is working with a professional, and whether this is a professional strength and conditioning coach or just a really experienced personal trainer or a physio or chiro or osteo or someone like that. I'd recommend that you do work with someone because it's always hard for us to find our weak points in movement. So when we have someone else watching us, we get immediate feedback, and I think that's invaluable. So some other reading resources for you. Paul Chek, his book, How to Eat, Move and Be Healthy, is a really nice overview of general movement principles, and then also a large focus on general health principles as well, which is something that you need to perform. And also The Science of Striking by Sam Gilbert is a really comprehensive resource on all these things. So to begin with, I want to quickly mention the success formula, and this is a formula that we have to do in order. So we want to develop optimal flexibility and then mobility with that. So that's your muscle flexibility, and your joint mobility refers to your joint range of motion, if your joints can go through a full range of motion or not. Then we want to develop stability, which is essentially our ability to stabilize a joint and control movement. And then from there, once we've developed those things, we want to move into developing optimal strength. And then once you've got a baseline level of strength, you can move more into that power, explosive, plyometric type work. So the problem is most people start at power and plyometric stuff when they should be starting at the more lower level movements. And we also want to correct posture before we go into real in-depth strength work. And in saying that, you can correct your posture through your strength work, but we want to be able to think about correcting posture before we go too much on heavy compound lifts. So some other considerations to think of. In combat sports, we have head contact and, for example, getting punched or kicked in the face. If you've been hit with any significant force, I would highly, highly recommend that you have a skilled physio or chiro or someone with those abilities to actually assess your neck and your jaw to make sure these things are balanced. So what can happen is, say, for example, you've had a big kick and you just left it, and then you go back to normal training, you may actually have asymmetrical movement of the neck. So it might get locked up on one side of the neck, as an example, and that's going to have a whole host of implications throughout the whole body. So an easy way you can test this is a weight shift test. The simplest way is you put two scales essentially side by side. And then what you do is you stand on them, so shoulder width apart, 1 foot on each scale. If you have a weight shift, so if one side is heavier, then more than about 2 to 2.5 kilograms, say for example, you're 5 to 10 kilos heavier on the left leg, as an example, then this means there's something happening in the body, normally something happening from the spine, not always, that can make a shift to one side. So we want to, that's an easy way to test if you do have a weight discrepancy, a weight shift discrepancy. So other considerations are, even if the pain has gone away, it doesn't mean that you're fully functioning because the nervous system always remembers, and there can be compensations. So easy example of this is if you have rolled your ankle in the past, you've never done any rehab on it, years down the track, you might still be walking with a bit of a limp or something happening through the ankle or something happening through that hip on the same side, as an example. So just because the pain's gone away, it doesn't mean that we're functioning fully. And another consideration for anyone that kicks in their sport, so obviously martial arts falls under that bracket, is the idea of core coordination. And this is where our hip flexors get really excited to work and they're facilitated. So they're really easily switched on. We'll talk about that in a little bit more depth later. Okay, next most important thing to begin with is our breathing patterns. So in our breathing pattern, there's a couple of common dysfunctions that occur. So the most common dysfunction is that we breathe from the chest muscles and the upper back muscles, and we use that to lift our ribs, as opposed to the diaphragm, which is that muscle shown on the right-hand side, as opposed to that diaphragm expanding and your ribs actually expanding in a three-dimensional position. So what we can see on that photo on the left, we have our inspiratory muscles, and then we have on the right our expiratory muscles. But essentially the diaphragm should be that key muscle of breathing. So breathing from the belly first, and then the chest can move a bit at the end. But what happens is if that's inverted, then we use our neck muscles and we use our rib muscles and we use our muscles of our upper back to try and lift the ribs and lift up from here. So what happens when we correct our breathing pattern? We recover quicker, we have greater aerobic capacity. We can, for example, recover quicker in between rounds as well. So there's a lot of implications there. We also decrease tension out of our neck and our upper back. So some common postures that we see in combat athletes, but also in general population as well. These are super common. So it's what we call the upper and the lower cross syndrome. So if you look on the left-hand side here, it's the shoulders rounding and rolling in, the head's dropping forward. And there's certain muscles here that we call tight or facilitated, which means that they want to switch on a lot of the time. And then we've got on the opposite side, we've got weak muscles. So muscles that actually need strengthening. So in this example, the tight pecs in the front of the shoulder might pull you, and then tight upper traps coming up through the neck. And then what may be weak is these deeper muscles in the neck that help to pull your chin back and tuck your chin in. And then we might have some other key shoulder muscles that are weak as well. When we look at the hips, again, this is really common for kickers, is that the hip flexors or the iliopsoas here, they get really tight, and then so do some of the muscles of the low back. And what tends to be weak or inhibited is the glute max, so the glutes, your butt muscles, and your abdominals, typically the lower portion of those abdominals. So really common, and we'll talk about how to work with those. So how do we correct them? The general rule is, so we have to stretch what's tight and strengthen what is weak. So we've got tight and weak labeled on these diagrams. The general rule for stretching is if you're doing the stretch and it doesn't feel tight, it most probably doesn't actually need stretching. So we want to bring the body into balance, into more optimal standing alignment from our start position. So that's our start position for movement. So as a general rule, if it's not tight, don't stretch it. And ideally, the stretching is to take place immediately before the strengthening. But we'll talk about how we're going to do that on the next slide. So how should we stretch? So before exercise, so before your martial arts training, before your weight training or cross conditioning, whatever it is that you're doing, ideally there should be pretty short duration holds, so about less than 5 seconds in duration. And we can use contract relax method. We can just do static stretches, but for that shorter duration. Or we can do more dynamic type stretches. So contract relax is where you try to engage the muscle and then you relax and take it into a bit of a further range of motion. Dynamic could be things like swinging leg raises and that sort of stuff, standing and that kind of type Meiki type position as a dynamic stretch. So after exercise or on our rest days, you can really hold a stretch for as long as you'd like. And if one side's tighter, as a kind of general rule, you can do it twice as much. So like a 2-to-1 ratio, stretching the tighter side twice as much. So again, we're trying to bring the body into balance through stretching. All right. So when we talk about biomotor abilities, this kind of breaks down our movement abilities. Okay. So broad categorizations, we have strength, we have power, we have speed, agility, balance, coordination, endurance, and flexibility. People talk about strength as being the mother of all skills, which essentially means that when we can improve our strength, you're also going to get quicker, you're going to get more powerful, you might become a bit more agile as well. It may not make you that much more balanced, or it won't necessarily increase your flexibility, but you can see how increasing your strength is going to help with a lot of these abilities. So that's why strength training is such a good place to start. So when we talk about the stability and the mobility, there is common mobility restrictions you see in general population and also in the athletic population. So these common mobility restrictions might be in the mid-back, so the middle spine, your hips, your shoulders. And then things like stability that we need for martial arts. We need single leg stability, because every time we kick, you're kicking off one leg. So you need good balance of your foot and ankle, and also the hip on that same side. And also things like your shoulder stability for the impact of a punch, core stability, because the core is what ties everything together. So I'm not going to give you examples just here, because it's very dependent person by person. And also, if you just jump on YouTube or something like that and search mobility exercises for the area of your body where you're tight, you'll find a lot of stuff. So there's heaps of stuff out there. All right. So why is strength training important? So it's not just about building more muscle, but we're also teaching our bodies how to work more efficiently, teaching our bodies how to work with more coordination, how to increase our power. We're going to have an injury prevention effect there, because the more resilient we are, the more loading it'll take to actually injure a certain body part. We're trying to bring our body also into structural balance through strength training. So that's the idea of balancing our body, having an equal muscle and strength development front to back of the body as one example, or either side of a joint. And then there's also many other health benefits. So things like we'll handle our blood sugar better, mental health benefits of training, stress management. So there's tons of benefits from strength training. All right, so how should you start with strength training? So I believe for a martial artist, a beginner program at about 2 days a week is enough to make a good start, and enough to make really good progress on that. Initially, you're going to start with higher rep ranges. So that's the 8 to 12 reps per set. And this is so we can really learn a movement. It's also so we can build muscle strength, but not just muscle, connective tissue strength. We're strengthening the joints as well. So lower rep range. So after less than 8 reps, in the 1 to 8 rep range, I'd say that's after at least a few months of consistent training, if not 6 to 12 months of consistent training, you can actually start to tap into that lower rep range and really develop more strength attributes. So you're teaching your body new movements as well. So that's why we have higher rep range, because that's the best rep range to try and learn movements. So we're going to start also with basic movement patterns, so fundamental movement patterns, and then we can progress down the track into more explosive and more complex movement patterns. But like anything in life, you've got to get the basics down first. And then once you've got the basics, you can progress that into more advanced stuff. So what movements are foundational or fundamental movement patterns? We've got a push, pull, a squat, lunge, a bend, or a hinge type movement, twisting, and gait, which is walking, jogging, or running. So just run through some example exercises of each. So as a push, we all know push-ups, overhead pressing, bench press. I personally really like standing with the cable machine, cable in each hand from a lunge type position, and you're pressing out. So that's another nice example there. Pull exercises. So we've got one arm rows, we've got bent over rows, seated cable rows here. Squatting. So there's tons of variations on all these movements as well. So we've got, for example, back squatting up the top, single leg squatting, goblet squat here, where you're holding the weight in this type position as you're squatting. You can also front squat as well, which is where the bar goes across the top of your shoulders, just underneath the collarbone. Lunging. So again, there's heaps of directions that we can utilize in lunging. So we can forward lunge, static lunge, we can lunge to the side here. You can lunge off at the 45-degree angle as well. So there's pretty much a huge variation you can utilize for lunging. We've also got the bend pattern, which is more that hinge or deadlift type pattern. So you can see in the top photo, more conventional deadlift. Down the bottom, more a stiff-legged or Romanian deadlift, which is targeting the hamstrings in the back of the leg here a lot more. And then you've got things like a back extension as well, which is a great movement for strengthening the whole back of the body. So the glutes, the hamstrings, the low back in particular. All right, twisting. So again, these are some examples of different rotational exercises you can do. So wood chops with a cable machine, or you can use a resistance band as well. Rotational or med ball throws, Russian twists, and things like using the landmine as well as a standing rotation. All right, so we'll break down a beginner program. So this is just something I've put together. It's just like something you could utilize as a beginner, but you could still get good results of this even if you're an advanced person in the gym. All right, so for day one, this is day one of the program. Your preparation would include specific mobility drills according to where you're tight, maybe a bit of static stretching, those short contract, relax stretching more so. And then you could utilize some stability drills as well if you want. So the way it's listed is A1, A2, which means the first two exercises are in a superset, which means you do them back to back and then you rest. So A1 is barbell back squat. So you're doing 3 sets of 10 to 12 reps, and I'll explain what we do with the rep range in a minute. So you do your 10 to 12 reps, and then you would go straight into your 1 arm row, 8 to 10 reps. Then you would rest for, depends how much you need, probably 45 to 60 seconds, most probably, maybe 90 seconds, something like that. But that's something you can worry about once you get a little bit more advanced in training. So you do back squat into row, rest, you do that 3 times, and then you move on. Then the next B series is a static lunge with a barbell or dumbbells, 8 to 10 reps per side, straight into push-up, and we've got 10 to 15 reps as a rep range. So if you can do that quite easy at body weight, then you just start putting things like weight plates on your back to make it a bit harder. So you do that again 3 times. And then C series, hamstring curl on Swiss ball, 10 to 15 reps, followed by a back extension at 45 degrees, 10 to 12 reps. And again, you're doing the same thing, supersetting 3 times through. As a day 2, same sort of thing. You got your own prep, which should be individual and unique to you. And then starting off at a barbell rack pull, which is like a deadlift out of the racks. Same thing, 3 sets. Then we've got seated dumbbell overhead press and pairing it with, same thing, 3 sets of 8 to 10. Then moving on, B series, you've got a dumbbell stiff-legged deadlift. You've got a barbell bench press, 3 sets of each. The rep range is a little bit different on those two. And then your C series, a seated cable row, followed by standing calf raise. So fairly fundamental movement patterns here, nothing too fancy. But again, you don't need fancy to begin. You just need basics and to master the basics. So core training. So when it comes to the idea of core training, we'd normally do this after our weight session. So you might do that example day. And then if you got 5 to 10 minutes afterwards, you'd move with some core stuff, finish with some core stuff. So like we talked about, re-education may be needed of the core, because what tends to happen for kickers, those hip flexors get really excited. So when you do things like the dead bug here, which is shown in this bottom picture, and you lower and lift the legs, a lot of people really use the hip flexors and their big, strong abs, the 6-pack abs, those outer muscles to do all the movement. But for these sort of lighter movements, really what we want to do is utilize some of the deeper muscles, and we shouldn't be bracing too hard to do these things. So that's where things like the idea of clinical Pilates, or again, a skilled physio, a skilled chiro, a skilled movement coach, they can be able to help you identify that and retrain that. That's particularly important to look at as well if you've got any back pain. So some other ways of training the core, we have planks, which pretty much everyone's familiar with, front planks, side planks. We have the bird dog, which is this movement here on the right-hand side. So you can do opposite arm and leg. You can also mix it up and make it a bit more challenging. You can draw the alphabet with your hands and your feet. You can do same side, arm and leg, just to make it more challenging. We've got crunches and weighted crunches as well. So again, it doesn't all have to be body weight. The dead bug is this position that we talked about down the bottom. We've got the Palloff press as another nice core exercise, which is what you see over on the right-hand side here. So you can use a cable machine or a resistance band, and you have to brace the core, punching the weight slowly in and out. So you've got to resist the rotation. The Swiss ball is a really nice tool for core training as well. So this is the jackknife shown down below, where you're in that push-up position and you're bringing your knees in towards your chest and your knees out. Or you could even start just by holding the static push-up position. That's one I really like. We got the wood chop variations, which is sort of what we've seen on a prior slide, we're using the cable machine to rotate through the abdominals and the mid-back. So they're nice variations as well. And then you've also got things like carries, which is where you would have a weight in one hand or a weight in two hands, and you're essentially just walking. So things like farmers carries. And if you do that particularly with one hand, it really forces everything to switch on throughout the midsection and stabilize. So when do you need to change your program? Essentially, you need to change it once you stop getting results. You can change the program. You should stay on a program probably for at least a month, because that gives you a chance to actually make strength gains and actually master the movements and learn the movements as well. The rep ranges, like we talked about briefly before, so you can access the lower rep ranges after you've built a base. So probably not in the first 6 months, definitely not in the first 6 months of training, but maybe even the first 12 months of training, just really building a base in that 8 to 12, 8 to 15 rep range per set. So when we utilize the lower rep range of 1 to 8 reps, we're actually teaching our body how to really switch our nervous system on and how to fire and recruit more motor neurons, which essentially means we can recruit more of our muscle fibers and get more out of the muscle fibers that we do have. Okay, so how do you ensure progress? This is where we utilize that rep range that we've seen in the example programs. So for example, if you have an 8 to 10 rep range, what you would do, week 1, you'd start at the lower end of the rep range, and then you'd find the weight where it's quite challenging. So essentially, what does challenging mean, and how do you know you're getting a little bit towards fatigue? Essentially, the speed of the movement is going to slow down in those last couple of reps. And that's how you know you're starting to tap into not failure, but you're getting closer to failure. So what you would do is, say, for example, you're doing 8 reps. You load up the bar with enough weight that on the last rep or two, it's getting hard. You're slowing down a little bit in the movement, but you couldn't get maybe more than another 2 reps out if you needed to. 2 to 3 reps in the tank is a good general rule. And then what you do, for example, so you did that weight for 8 reps over the 3 sets. And then the next week, what you do is you go to the higher end of the rep range. So it's 8 to 10 reps. So you go to the 10 reps and then with the same weight. So what you're doing is you're accumulating more work, more volume is being accumulated. Okay. Then what you do week 3, you go back down the lower end of the rep range, you're back to 8 reps again. But because you're already strong and you've already built up that little bit of volume capacity with that weight, now we're going to increase the weight. Same sort of rules apply. So we want to make the last couple of reps really hard to get out, but there's still good form there always. We never sacrifice on form, particularly in the gym. And then what you would then do, week 4, you go to the higher end of the rep range, so using that same weight. So you can just keep utilizing that system of low end of the reps, next week, high end of the reps, next week, increase the weight, back down to the low end. You can keep utilizing that system essentially for as long as you're getting results on your program. And that's what we call progressive overload. So that means over time, you're actually lifting more weight, more volume, you're getting stronger. So that means the body has a reason to adapt. So the body only adapts to a given stimulus if it's there. Otherwise, the body's quite lazy. It doesn't want to put on extra muscle mass if it doesn't have to. All right, so how do you train throughout the year? So training will follow a somewhat similar format, month to month. It will be periodized, but around your competition. So essentially around your competition, you want to really work on probably more towards maximum strength, or the sort of, say, 1 to 8 rep range you might do in a couple of your sets, in a couple of your series, or A series maybe. And maybe some more explosive stuff might come in there around the competition phase. You also might start to work a little bit more, potentially strength endurance stuff as well. So you could mix it up. There's so many ways to program. We also want to think of keeping a variety of planes of movement and exercises. So what does that mean? That means that we're balancing our body. We might do some rotational training in there. So we're training in that rotational plane. We might do some more lateral work where we're holding, for example, a weight in one hand and you're doing a standing side crunch. So you're teaching your body how to be strong in multiple positions and multiple planes of movement, which is really important for martial arts. There's also the idea of contrast training, which is when you're more experienced, you can do this stuff. So you might do, for example, a set of 3 to 5 squats of a heavy barbell back squat, straight away followed by 3 to 5 jumping squats, just body weight where you're trying to jump as high as you can. So, or tuck jumps or something like that. So that's an example of contrast training. Another example of contrast training might be a heavy sort of bench press. For again, you could use a 3 to 5 rep range, followed by explosive clapping push-ups or something like that. So we utilize supersets because it's pretty time efficient. It means you have to spend less time in the gym, you get more done. Another way of laying out your training, probably more around the competition time, is something we call a giant set, which is where you could do, say, picking 3 to 5 different movements, and you might even chuck a bit of conditioning in there. So what that might look like is a deadlift, so heavy deadlift, 3 to 5 reps, into a set of lunges, into a set of push-ups, into a set of TRX row, followed by some ball slams or a battle rope or something a little bit more conditioning in nature to finish with. So what you're actually doing within the one set, you're doing strength stuff, you're doing some muscle type work, more hypertrophy range, and then you're actually getting some conditioning in. So that's one way of doing it. Some other areas of consideration, other areas of training that you may want to include and should include, I think, include your adductors, which is the groin muscles, the inner thigh muscles. It's really important for your hip stability. And also we need them to be strong for powerful kicks, and the neck as well. So we don't commonly train our neck too much unless you're a grappler. But we do want to train our neck to resist an impact of getting hit, okay? So as a general recap, we want to optimize our flexibility and mobility and our stability first. Strength training is very important for athletic development and injury prevention. Invest in a coach if you can. And again, it doesn't have to mean you have a coach forever, but at least someone, if you're new to this, to really teach you the basics and master the movements and give you some body awareness. And again, that base building phase is going to go for at least the first 6 to 12 months of training. And you can always come back to base building as well in the off season, in between competitions and all that sort of stuff. So I hope this presentation really helps you all with the foundations of weight training. Again, it's not meant to be a super comprehensive resource, but it's just giving you some ideas and giving you perhaps a bit of inspiration to explore this within your own training. So thanks for listening.